fifth grade, we're going to go ahead and get started on Chapter 15, which is the Eastern Europe countries, okay? So this time, for this next two chapters that we're finishing in our history book, you will not be taking any notes, but you will need to be listening very carefully through the review of these pages. So what you should have done was start off by reading all of the pages that are on your lesson plan sheet and then coming to this review video so that you can do the worksheet provided. We will be doing the worksheet together, okay? So make sure you've read the pages before you start this video. Now, the first country we're going to talk about in Eastern Europe is Russia. Now, Russia is the world's largest nation, and only a portion of Russia actually lies in Eastern Europe. The rest of it goes over into Asia, okay? Now, we've talked about communist government before, okay? And that is a system of government that says that there is no God and doesn't give people any freedom, okay? Not quite a government that we ever want to see take place in the United States as we live here, let alone really any other country. But we still have that going on in the countries around. Now, once the Soviet Union started, then communism ended up spreading throughout Eastern Europe, okay? And back in ancient times, I could say, back in AD times, okay, in the 9th century AD, there was a Viking tribe named Rus, and that is where the descendant of Noah's son Jephthah came from, okay? And so this Viking tribe actually went into the Europe area and ended up, by the hand of Vladimir Saint, introducing the Russians into Christianity. But that is where the Viking tribe went and took over part of Eastern Europe and Asia as Rush, or the land of Rush, and is now called Russia. Now, the city of Kiev is the political and religious center of Russia, and about 1240, Mongols ended up conquering over Russia, and they controlled it for nearly about 250 years. Now, once the Mongolian troops were defeated, Ivan III was a prince of Moscow, and he ended up becoming the first true national leader of the United Russia. Okay? Later, then Ivan IV took the title of Tsars, which meant emperor. Okay? And known as Ivan the Terrible, the Tsars passed laws tying the peasant farmers to the land. So now this is where the change ended up really taking place in Russia. This is when a new class of people started in Russia, kind of the same time when over in Western Europe they had the new classes of the serfs and the peasants, and they had the different classes going on there. That's when this all took place over in Russia. Now, there were a few great Tsars, which were emperors, remember, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Alexander the First. Another Tsars Nicholas the First, he ended up adding many countries to the Russian Empire as he went ahead and crushed the different efforts of the Eastern European countries, and he started to build the Russian Empire. The Crimean War against England, France, Turkey, and Sardinia took place with Russia in 1854 to 1856, and from 1850 to 1890, the Russian Empire continued to expand further into Eastern Europe, and Central and East Asia. Napoleon was a French emperor, remember? And he decided he wanted to march into Russia and kind of take over. And he did. However, the occupied Moscow ended up going ahead and basically burning down the city, leaving the French with nothing, no food or anything, and they ended up retreating. So I guess when you don't want your country taken over, hey, just burn it down. And that might make the people leave. That's basically what they did. Now, Alexander II came in later, and he ended up freeing some of the slavery type thing that was going on over there with the serfs, and he started to give the land and government back to the people. He was eventually assassinated, but Alexander III defeated and crushed whoever dared speak ill against the government. And Alexander III's son, Nicholas II, he wanted to preserve the past. So Nicholas II was the last Tsars who attempted to reform the people, but that political unrest ended up, and the spiritual darkness brought over terror and revolution to the land. And so what he did didn't work out at that time, but his intentions were good. Now, while this started to have a problem there in Russia, things were kind of out of a breaking point. This is when Marxism or communism ended up taking hold in the Russian era. And so Karl Marx was a German Jew who had been exposed to German Christianity, but he rejected it. And he wanted the working class to control the government, and he wanted Christianity and the upper classes to be abolished. So he basically wanted everyone to be on the same level, and that's what communism is, right? And so he was opposed to free enterprise, to capitalism, which is making whatever money you want to make on whatever product you design, and which is our American way. And he didn't want people running their own businesses or handling their own money. He really just wanted, he didn't think people should own factories or property or land or any of that. And he thought it should all be taken away from them. And he wanted everyone to be equal. And this ended up causing a challenge because this is not a benefit for the people. But his ideas were so strong that he really led the country into communism, and it really took over in Russia. Now in 1917, the Russian people actually overthrew the Tsar's government in attempts to temporarily put together a government that was much like the Western representative democracy and individual liberty, but unfortunately, some of the Russian people started listening to Marx, and also the communists, and also Bolshevik, which also there was a leader, Vladimir Lenin. And he said that in order to have a successful communist government, they actually needed to kill entire classes of people, okay? And the Bolsheviks actually overthrew the government that the people had set up, and Lenin became the very first communist state leader in history. And there was really no hope for a representative type government after this time with Russia. And so Russia did get involved in the Civil War, and the communists were called White Russians, and whoever favored or who opposed, those who opposed communism were called White Russians, and those who favored communism were called Red Russians. Interesting, right? Now, in 1921, communism brought about the complete collapse of the Russian history. Now, the interesting thing is while the country started going downhill because of this communism type thing, and people were starting to starve to death, instead of saying that Lenin was wrong, they actually put together a system of ideas that was like capitalism, but they don't want to say it's capitalism, allowing people to have small private businesses and things, but really it was his way of realizing things weren't working right with communism, but really not admitting it, which is kind of funny. And so, being led by Lenin and the communists, which was the worse than the Tsar's government, Lenin took away all the freedoms in Russia, including speech, press, religion, and enemies of the state were put in prison and executed. I mean, there was really no life, like a value to man's life under him. And communism took over the education, taught that capitalism and Christianity was evil, and they were forced to conform to the government he wanted them to know about. So then the Communist Party basically started using propaganda, and propaganda is using something in a deceptive way so that it actually convinces people to try something. So like saying, showing like, oh, this cream makes your skin so soft, right? And then you buy the cream to make your skin so soft. So that's a small example of it, but unfortunately he was convincing people to do other things in that area, and that was not allowing them to have the freedoms that they deserved. Okay, so then in 1924, Lenin died, and there was two Russian leaders that basically struggled for power, and that was Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. And one was actually murdered, and that was Trotsky, okay? And while Stalin ended up becoming one of the most brutal rulers of all time, okay? He was, if anyone was opposed to him, they were just killed. If anyone disagreed with him, they were just killed. He actually ordered small farms and businesses and everything to collect crops, give them back to the government, and if you protested, you were killed, and you were sent to camps. And he basically, the remaining farmers destroyed or hid their grain from him, just trying to, help themselves. But communism took over really bad, and his brutal dictatorship made things really hard.